Look, it's my particular honour to host this year's Bradfield Oration because 2023 marks the 10th and arguably the most important edition of this grand event. Today, the Daily Telegraph's Bradfield Oration is coming up on 10 years of creativity, 10 years of agenda setting, 10 years of imagineering and 10 years of accomplishment from some of Sydney's most celebrated and forward-thinking citizens. Congratulations is due to all the Daily Telegraph's Bradfield Oration participants, some of whom are with us today, for being such significant and thoughtful contributors during these nigh on 10 years. So please, everybody, show your appreciation for our Bradfield orators. In 10 years, yeah, it's a long time, although some here perhaps may understand this more clearly if it's expressed in alternative chronological terms. It's a time frame equal to, for example, 4 Prime Ministers, or the same number of New South Wales Premiers. And if he keeps going at his present rate, 180 Anthony Albanese overseas trips. The Prime Minister was last year's Bradfield orator, and he couldn't be here today, by the way. He does send his apologies. But here are some measures that should remind us of the Bradfield Oration's origin and purpose, and also give us a bit more of a serious moment of reflection. As we speak, it is slightly more than 9 years since the inaugural oration was delivered in 2014. Seems like yesterday. But consider, however, a bit of a humbling comparison. It took less than 9 years to build from scratch the entire Sydney Harbour Bridge. From the sod turning ceremony in 2023 to the bridge's opening in 1932, it took only 8 years and 8 months. Look at it this way. John Bradfield's bridge, knocked together by workers and craftsmen, equipped only with blueprints, rivets, girders and a dollop of coverage, they beat the 10th edition of the Bradfield Oration to completion by about 18 weeks. Now, I don't make this point to annoy any government, development and building authorities who may be present in the room today, and I don't mean to draw attention to the awesome, almost incalculable advantages their modern software gives them over men and women of the 1930s, who, when it came to city reshaping infrastructure design, relied entirely on pencils and rulers. Except that I very much do want to do those things. It should concern us that Sydney is so often unable to swiftly meet the political, engineering and social challenges that nearly 100 years ago were easily overcome by people whose primary source of protein was rabbit. So we must do better. We must move faster and we must achieve more with less. Let's keep a harbour bridge timeline in mind when we picture where Sydney might be by the time of the 20th Bradfield Oration. 8 years and 8 months from now, our city will be massively and unavoidably changed and improved, if we get it right, by population growth. So, do we meet that challenge, or do we hold our head in our hands and say, it's all too much? I know which Sydney I prefer, and if I compare our situation to that faced by Sydney 1 century ago in 1923, the sensible and visionary solution then was to overbuild. The Harbour Bridge featured an amount of lanes that must have seemed absolutely ludicrous compared to that era's traffic demands. Now look at Sydney's housing statistics. As house prices and soaring rentals indicate, we have underbuilt. In fact, we've been underbuilding housing since the Sydney Olympic era time of progress. That decades-long stall on building and expanding that really followed was an enormous waste of momentum. But let's keep the emphasis on our past abundant positives. There's no reason that the same spirit that drove our city's unification of north and south cannot deliver a unification of people and property, a widespread and affordable coming together of supply and demand. Bureaucratic barriers need to be swatted aside. That's a given. The Telegraph has long opposed developmental red tape and will champion any government that meaningfully carves through it. Housing is to Sydney now as the bridge was to John Bradfield's time. If solving the housing situation seems difficult, it's only because we've lost the kind of realistic and practical optimism that once defined our city. And the same thing applies to the infrastructure that will be needed to support our growing city. And not just support it, but make the city a great and attractive place to live for the century to come. Remember, when the Harbour Bridge was built, it seemed like an impossibly expensive project. The debt wasn't retired for 56 years when a government debt restructure paid it off in one fell swoop. But if you dive back into the archives, you can see the worries. The can we afford it crowd, they were out in force. In the Canberra Times in October 1955, for example, there was an article that fretted Harbour Bridge heavily in debt and that worried that it wouldn't be paid off until 2005. And of course, it would be redundant because we'd be driving around in flying cars. Okay, so I'm kidding, but I kind of wish I wasn't. The point is, the government took on the debt, but it also had an asset too, and it worked. And it did this before more sophisticated finance arrangements were available, or the idea to work with private operators and builders who have mountains of money to invest here if we only gave them the nod. A great example of this is the idea for a new indoor entertainment arena. As much as $500 million could be unlocked if we were only able to give those people with that money the nod. And that's what I mean by getting back to that optimism. An optimism that recognised that challenges made sport of defeating them. That's Sydney already partially in place. It's already partially in place. We've got the second international airport under construction and not far from completion. We've also got imaginative apartment plans that have been put to the public. So that sort of optimism we're on the precipice of it. We've just got to build it. I reckon it'll take about 8 years or so. Thank you. And now, it is my very great pleasure and honour to introduce our 2023 Bradfield Orator. Please welcome Premier Chris Minns.